pleasure to be on the agenda with our three other speakers. I fill my notebook with notes every time I hear any of the three of them talk, so it's really great to be here. One thing that I really appreciate about all three is how they make things practical, and it's not just the science and data and what do we wish things were, but what does this really mean to the growers, to you as a grower, or the growers that you work with? And I'll try to follow that through in maybe 10 minutes and talk to you about, well, one thing that is real to a grower, or if you are a grower or growers that you work with, if they're covered by the produce safety rule, is that more and more people every year are going to be subject to inspections. And well, needless to say, inspections are things that make a few people nervous. So my goal here is just to help you understand what an inspector might be looking at in the near term, and try to demystify it and make this as and see how the inspectional process would view all the great science, knowledge, and risk reduction practices that we've been talking about. Notice here, first thing, current understanding. And I just want to emphasize that this is all about our current understanding, because this is a new somebody, I can't remember if it was Faith or Chana, said we're on the cutting edge. We're learning new things all the time. We're figuring this out as things do roll out. So in general, we're going to talk about what water treatments might be of interest during an inspection, emphasis on the word might. Because there are produce safety regulatory requirement considerations when it comes to water treatment. Briefly, we've already talked about the EPA label, but I'll talk about what that means to an inspector, and then just briefly about the CDFA inspectors themselves. So I added a couple slides at the last minute because I noticed a few people who were here this week were not here last week. So this is just a quick reminder that the produce safety rule compliance dates for water do not come into effect until 2022 or later, meaning that there are not specific requirements having to do with MWQPs and GMs and STVs and all those other acronyms that we've been throwing around. But what is important until compliance dates for water come around are that a farm may not sell adulterated produce, and one way to adulterate produce is by poor quality water. From last week, we talked a little bit about produce safety rule requirements related to water that are under re-evaluation. We talked about what those rules say right now, but until they are, I just want to be clear that until they are published in final form, the inspectors will not be inspecting against subpart E other than sprouts as part of the produce safety rule inspections. What they will have in mind, though, are the overriding umbrella Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, that no adulterated food may be sold into interstate commerce. And then there is one requirement in the produce safety rule that is very relevant to a CDFA inspector, 112.11. Basically, it says that a farm must take appropriate measures to minimize risks of illness or death from known or reasonably foreseeable hazards, including water that is not suitable for use on that produce. So we do want to convey that there are some concerns about water quality, and that if the water is so bad that it could adulterate produce or make it unfit to be eaten, then the inspector would actually have a reason to talk about it, even though the requirements of subpart E as written are not currently enforceable. There are other avenues that the inspector would would take. We're not looking at the details. We're just looking at the imminent risk to public health issues. Finally, from the water treatment webinar, from the webinar last week, we talked about treatments and promised more information today, and that's why we're going to talk about inspections and antimicrobial pesticides, otherwise known as sanitizers or disinfectants, depending on whether you're into drinking water treatment or produce safety rule treatment. So, feel a little bit out of breath. I'm trying to speak fast, and but I hope we don't minimize the importance of what is said in the interest of having plenty of time for questions and answers. Somebody,
good,
yes,
you're good. Just take your time. I think
okay.
we're good on time.
All right, thanks for the reassurance, Linda. I don't usually fluster in a presentation, but we'll be there. So to get to the meat of things, I think it was Jana talked about the different use categories on an EPA label. You can see control of plant pathogens. You can see control of slime, control of algae. The inspectors are not going to be looking for those because they're not part of produce safety rule. What is part of produce safety rule is the microbial quality of the water, the sanitary quality of the water. So and labels will say this in different ways, but one of the phrases that sometimes used on an EPA label is that is for use to control microorganisms of public health significance or concern. And what we mean by that long phrase is either pathogens, things that are going to make people sick, or indicators of risk from pathogens, such as generic E. coli. They can also be used to sanitize or control microorganisms of public health concern on non-porous food contact surfaces. That's outside the scope of this webinar because we're really just talking about water. So the regulatory considerations that our inspectors might be looking for are, okay, well, if the inspector has reason to believe that a water source that's being used in direct contact with produce is not of sufficient sanitary quality, and there are no measurements of E. coli that would give some evidence about the quality, well, then there might be a risk of adulteration, or there might be a risk of violation of 112.11. So in those cases, and really there are probably other cases, but that's one example of a case where an inspector might ask during an inspection, well, are you treating this water to address this water quality issue that seems to be there? You've got cattle who have access to your water source. It may not be of appropriate quality. What are you doing about it? How do you use that water? And if the claim is that I treat the water to reduce the risk from that source of hazards, well, the inspector would ask questions about, well, what do you know about this treatment that makes you believe that it's going to achieve your goal? And Faith brought this out very well in her discussion of HACCP. It's exactly the same concepts. You're doing this thing. How do you know that it's going to achieve the goal? And Shannon did a nice job of talking about the efficacy statements and the protocols that are used by EPA and FDA so that the manufacturer of a chemical can demonstrate that when used under these conditions, we have validation, not verification, validation that you will be able to meet the goals of sufficient quality. So that one thing I just said, under these conditions, the label use instruction is going to have some control parameters, like what's the pH, what's the active ingredient. Faith and Shanna both were mentioning bleach-based sanitizers having a target for active ingredient being something like 2 to 5 or something like that in the examples that they used. So the label will give, the EPA label is not just a requirement under EPA regulations, but it also includes that validation information that when it's used in this way, so it lets you know what should be measured in order to demonstrate that that the treatment is being used effectively. And some of those common control parameters are active ingredient, pH, contact time, things that you've heard us talk about. The inspectors are going to be thinking about those same things if they were to have reason to ask questions about treatment that was used on the farm. Some additional considerations. Performance-based, is there appropriate monitoring? You've got the control parameters. Shanna showed some really nice control charts of continuous data. A lot of farms, especially the smaller farms, aren't going to have continuous data, but even with continuous data, you've got a meter or some other device that's going to be monitoring. So the inspector might reasonably say, well, is it calibrated? And then if it's a lower tech situation where you're using something like a dip strip, a chemical changing paper strip, they should be in the appropriate range. If your target is 2 to 5 parts per million, you shouldn't be using a strip that has a range that goes up to 1,000, because usually you can't tell the difference between 0 and 25 on those strips. Is it the right target chemical? Using the example of a bleach-based sanitizer again, there is a strip that measures total chlorine, and there's another strip that measures free available chlorine. You would want to use the free available chlorine strip. And then finally, ensuring that those strips are not expired, because this is one of those things where the expiration date is a real thing, that past the expiration date, the color change characteristics change and they are no longer appropriate for use. Things that aren't performance-based, probably outside the scope of an inspection, I just want to bring them up because it's a pet peeve or soapbox. That label from EPA also includes personal protective equipment, so that if face mask and gloves are required for safe handling of that chemical, it's a good idea on the farm to be doing those things. Disposal instructions. We don't want to be harming the environment by using these chemicals. So that information is found on the US EPA label. The label, following the full label, is a US EPA requirement. It's not part of the produce safety rule. The inspector is probably not going to ask about those things, but I felt like it seems worthwhile to at least discuss and make sure everyone's aware of that. Just briefly, Linda talked about the LGMA metrics, and the LGMA metrics have separate rules that are different from produce safety rule requirements, generally considered equivalent to produce safety rule requirements. However, the LGMA metrics are separate, and they're not part of, I just want to say that they're not part of an LGMA inspection. Those are not part of a produce safety rule inspection, excuse me. LGMA audits are conducted by CDFA, but they're a different branch. The LGMA audits are separate from produce safety rule inspections, carried out by a different team. EPA label is used in most cases to evaluate efficacy, to evaluate whether it's used. I just want you to, or what I wanted to do with this slide is to bring up two resources for you. One is, how do you know whether the US EPA or the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, have jurisdiction over a particular chemical use? So that that URL gives a flow chart that helps understand under what conditions is it an EPA requirement and what conditions is it an FDA requirement. And to reiterate here, the EPA governs the use instructions. The produce safety rule, which is inspected by CDFA under FDA credentials, focuses on effective use, and that EPA label is one way to show that you are making effective use of the chemical to achieve our water quality goals and our risk reduction goals. If you're looking for EPA labels, I would point out the Produce Safety Alliance has a sanitizer spreadsheet that lines things up and helps you to know what are the acceptable uses of that product, and helps you find the labels. And then I just want to wrap up with a few slides that we also presented last week, but there are different people on this week. So we want to make sure everyone's aware that the CDFA inspectors are under the produce safety program in CDFA. There are 5 regions. The inspectors generally work within region and they support across regions. Those inspections are generally, we are currently doing the majority of initial inspections. Those are regulatory with an inspectional approach. Routine and follow-up inspections might be more specific, but some key characteristics of those inspections, so that everyone who is inspected or who is subject to inspection or works with farms that are subject to inspection, we want you to know that the inspections are announced. We don't just show up. When possible, we schedule those inspections. The time for an inspection varies. It can take hours. It can take up to a half a day. It depends on the specific farm, the specific situation, and how complex the situation is. Unlike audits, inspections are not optional. We will ask, can we come? But the answer is yes. There is an obligation to get inspected, and we'll work with you to schedule an inspection at an appropriate time for you. At the end of the inspection, the farm will receive a report from CDFA that describes the findings of the inspection. So finally, a couple more resources. There is information on our website. The Produce Safety Program site includes a questionnaire that can help a farm understand what their coverage status is. In other words, are they subject to inspections? And that's the topic of a whole nother webinar's worth of information, is who is covered, who is excluded, and who is exempt for various reasons. And you can find that information on the Produce Safety Program page. And then finally, we have a page that's with it, that's a sub page called What to Expect During an Inspection. And that we're updating that currently to have even more useful information, but we think that that will be a very valuable resource for farms to understand what the inspection entails if you are subject. I believe that's my last slide. It is my last slide. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Linda. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. 3 great presentations. I really appreciate. Yeah, it's as I said earlier, it's complex. It's not easy, and it's. I think growers who are wanting to use this as an option really need to think through all of the different items that you all brought up today. My colleague Erin DiCaprio is also there. You are. So Erin, you, I don't see that we have any questions in the chat. Well, actually, there is one now. Do you want to read that, or do you want me to? Okay, I will go for it. And I didn't know if there was, if you were going to pull up some questions from the registration, but Kathy asks Dawn, when CDFA finds a corrective action, what is the timeline given for compliance?
So I was writing in the chat, but verbally is pretty good.
Yeah.
So first, it's a great question. We talked about it last week in a little bit more depth, so I want to make sure that to reference last week so that you can go back to that video and see what was said last week in more depth. But in short, if the issue is what we call an egregious condition where there's an imminent risk to public health, that correction has to be done immediately. That produce cannot get to the consumer if it's not suitable for eating because of an egregious condition. But if it's an observation that something should be improved on the farm, there is some discretion and some situation specific considerations to make. Generally speaking, though, it's a matter of weeks or a month or something like that. We want it done in a reasonable period of time, weeks or so, and a lot depends on what the particular condition is and whether it is likely to lead to contaminated produce getting into the marketplace. That's really our goal, is to avoid that outcome.
Perfect. Thank you. So there's another question. I think this is gonna fall into Jenna's bucket. Say you're a grower treating your pre-harvest water with an ag pesticide that is not labeled for use to treat microorganisms of public health concern. Well, so is that okay from an inspection perspective? And would a grower then need to validate the treatment if the pesticide is not approved for that specific purpose? So there's a lot in this question to unpack here. And I think part of it depends on what this ag pesticide is being used for, right? Because you can. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll start, and then Faith and Dawn either correct me how you're interpreting this or suggestions. So, if you're using an ag pesticide, obviously you have to use it according to the label for what the label states that it's supposed to be used for. So you cannot claim that you're using an ag pesticide to treat those public health pathogens or those microorganisms, because that's not on the label. So you can use that ag pesticide to treat biofilm if that's on the label. And we'll just use that as an example. You may be getting the unintended benefit of also reducing those organisms that you are required to be monitoring for produce safety rules. So generic E. coli, for example, that is the unintended beneficial consequence of also deploying that agricultural pesticide. Now, is it in your best interest to monitor or collect samples of your system pre and post to confirm that you are actually meeting those objectives? Absolutely. But from an inspectional standpoint, I'll let Dawn respond on how they view that. But you can't sit there and say that you're using this ag pesticide to treat those organisms, because that would be an off-label use of that pesticide.
I see Faith pointedly not unmuting, so I'll go next. Yeah, this is a lot like that that text that dialogue that we had a little while ago, Chana.
Yep.
So first, CDFA is not out there to evaluate and inspect against EPA's rules about uses. What the FDA or what the CDFA inspector will be interested in is whether, if there's a reason to treat the water, whether that treatment is effective. So you're exactly right that there would be some expectation that there was a validation that that treatment is effective, not whether you're meeting the FIFR requirements, but rather is that treatment effective to meet the goal of appropriate water quality. I'm going to go a little bit out on a limb and go back to what's something that Faith said. Something that kills E. coli does not necessarily kill Cyclospora. So although we're not inspecting against subpart E as it's written, one key component of subpart E is safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use, which is different from the amount of E. coli that's in it. So even if you're showing low enough E. coli, I think from a risk perspective, if there's a reason to believe that it is, to use the colloquial term, dag nasty water before you treated it, and the only evidence that you have is that it's no longer dag nasty is there's no E. coli, I think there would be room for a conversation there. I would be a little cautious.
And I know it's really uncomfortable, right? I know many of you are either the ones managing risk within an operation, or you're educators, right? Helping communicate to growers. I like to say, okay, let's not get too caught up in the shifting sands that we may be experiencing right now, because this is really what we've been doing in post-harvest water, for a long time. If you look at many of those labels, it will be specific to treating spoilage organisms or decay-causing organisms in those post-harvest water sections of a certain label. We don't necessarily have data on that label. There are a few products out there that have started to get them, but I would say the majority of the products being used for post-harvest, like flume, dump tank, or batch water washing systems, fall within that category. So don't feel too unhinged when it comes to it's not on the label and you still have to try and meet these requirements, but do make sure that you're not throwing good money right down the drain, that you're actually hopefully going to be effective in what you're doing.
And there certainly can be negative consequences of inappropriate use of chemicals. So not just regulatory issues, but negative consequences to equipment, or to, as you mentioned, soil health, or to other things. So that's why there's a label in the first place, to guide people on a safe and effective use.